Okay. Um, well, thank you for having me again. I just put something in the chat. This is a book that I think maybe your committee might be interested in reading. I found it very helpful. It's called The Search to Belong by Joseph Myers. He was a small group specialist, used to go all around the world, literally, helping churches set up small group programs back in the, I guess in the 90s, when that was kind of the in thing. And he discovered after a while that it didn't matter what the church did, eventually small group participation would settle to about 15%. Then you'd have a special kickoff campaign again, and it might go up to 25%, but it would go back to 15%. And he tried to figure this out, and the book is really an exploration of what's going on, and how we help, how we think about church membership. I found it really helpful, and it just might be interesting. And it's a small book, easy to read. You could read it in a couple of evenings pretty easily. But I put that link to it on Amazon. I'm not advocating Amazon. Don't misunderstand me. It's just the easiest, quickest place to find it. Uh, so let me read the first 11 verses of the book of Ecclesiastes. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Just a breath, says the preacher, just a breath. Everything is just a breath. What profit does a man get from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth stands forever, for ages. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and panting toward its place, it rises there again. Going toward the south, then going toward the north, the wind continues going along, and on its circular courses, the wind comes back. All the rivers go into the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers go, there they go again. All things are wearisome. A person cannot speak. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear is not satisfied with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which we might say, see this, it's new? Already, it's existed for ages which were before us. There's no remembrance of the earlier things, the first things, actually, he says, and also of the things which come later. There will be for them no remembrance among the things that come even after them. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
So I did actually talk about Ecclesiastes a few years ago, 10 years ago to be exact. But I figure, 10 years is not a bad time to kind of remind both myself and help us think about this a little bit. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I have an eye on the clock because I have a class in exactly 1 hour, just a little less than 1 hour. So I've got to get across campus then. But so we don't know who Kohelet was. There's a lot of, the rabbis said that it was Solomon because the rabbis' theory was that biblical books had to be written by a prophet. They couldn't figure out anyone else, so they assigned this to Solomon, along with the Song of Songs, which actually says Solomon's, and Proverbs, which also says it's by Solomon. They just put these, and they divided it into Solomon's 3 periods of life: his youth, the Song of Songs, and his maturity, in the book of Proverbs, and then his old age when he was tired and kind of cynical, to the book of Ecclesiastes. But that's just, frankly, that's just made up. We're just trying to explain something. We don't know who he was. We don't know which, because the son of David could mean any of David's descendants. Remember, son in Hebrew just means male descendant. It could be grandson, great-grandson, great-great-great-grandson. It could be any person. And when we look at the way he uses the language, the Hebrew of Ecclesiastes is not like what we find in Proverbs. It's not like what we find in Song of Songs. The vocabulary is different. He uses words here. He doesn't use any. Well, every biblical book has words that are unique to that book. But Ecclesiastes seems to specialize in things like that. And also just the way it would be nice to be able to have a year of just Hebrew lessons, so we could look at the Hebrew grammar and think, wow, this doesn't sound like anything I read anyplace else in the Bible. And we'd be right. It's not like that. He puts words together in a different order. Just a very, very strange. It's actually a strangely written book. which is why when you read different translations, they vary so widely. But one thing they all agree on, unfortunately, is that he's talking about vanity, or the NIV was the first translation to use the word meaningless instead of vanity in verse 2. And so all of a sudden it became fashionable to come up with words like meaningless or senseless or purposeless, or those sorts of that kind of language. But actually the word is the word breath. He says breath of breaths, everything is a breath. And at first that sounds like, okay, so where does the meaningless come from? Well, it actually comes from the Septuagint. When the Greeks translated it, they used mataiatos, which means emptiness, or, well, vanity. And and so we've kind of received that translation, which comes in our English directly from the Vulgate, because vanitas vanitatum is how Jerome translated it, influenced by the Septuagint, even though he was using the Hebrew text. But actually, that's all an interpretation of what a breath is. And if we think a breath is in vain, then I have a little suggestion. Just try not breathing for, let's say half an hour. See what happens. Because that kind of suggests that breath is really important. We breathe in, and now we've got this oxygen that gets, I don't remember my high school biology enough to know, but I know somehow it gets everywhere it needs to go in the body, at least so far. And then we breathe out, and it's gone, and we can't get it back. And even if our breaths were, it's kind of bizarre to think of, different colors, so we could know, oh, blue breath, that's Scott, and Sal's breath is orange, or whatever it is, doesn't matter. Within seconds, they would all be mixed together. We'd never be able to separate those molecules from each other. And so in the same way, he's saying, look, it's all ephemeral. It's all transient. It's all impermanent. There's nothing that we can do to make something that's permanent. And that's really his theme, which he repeats at the very end of the book in chapter 12. At the very end, he's going to say exactly the same thing that he says in the second verse here. He says, look, guys, don't forget, it's all just a breath, everything. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, it's all going to pass away. Once you exhale, it's gone. It's important when you inhale. That's really important, because without it, you die. But once we exhale, it's gone. And everything we do and our lives are the same way. I tell my students, when I teach electives, I teach mainly freshmen. My Old and New Testament classes are for the Templeton freshmen, but I also teach electives. And usually in my electives, I get a bunch of seniors. And so I tell them toward the end of their last semester, you're going to graduate and you're going to leave, and you're going to forget us. And I say to them, I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty, or to make you say, I'll never forget, or I'll keep in contact. I'm not trying to do that to you. What I want you to understand is that's normal. That's the way life is. Things change, and we can't do anything about that. Things will change, because life is a breath. And just as that breath comes in, as surely as it comes in, it's going to go out. And as surely as he goes on to say, we'll see in a moment, our lives are the same way. So he says that, makes that statement, which to us sounds very bleak. I'll come back to it in a minute. But then he goes on and asks a question, which is an interesting way to start a book, isn't it? What advantage does a man get, or mankind, it could be, it's Adam, from in all his labor at which he labors, or his toil at which he toils under the sun? What advantage is there? What profit is there? That's one of those words that he's the only biblical author who uses that word, yitron. So what profit is there? And that's one of the great questions, right? because that's a way of asking what meaning is there in life. It's probably one of the two greatest human questions. One of them is, does my life mean anything, or what does my life actually mean? And the other one is anybody going to love me? Am I lovable? Will I be? Am I loved? And when we think that, Jean-Paul Sartre said, this is the basis for the joy of love, that we feel our existence is justified. So we ask this question, what justifies my existence? Which is really what he's asking here in verse 3. He's really asking that question. What profit is there in everything that I do? All these things that I do. We had a flood in our basement, a couple of pipes burst, water came down from the ceiling, and water came sideways from a feed pipe, and the whole basement's been torn up, and I've been building cabinets and doing all sorts of things, and thinking to myself while I'm doing it, when I die and someone else owns this house, are they going to rip these out and say, what hack did this? Because I am a hack. I'm not a woodworker. Just trying to make things more livable for my wife and cut down on the cost of restoring everything. So, what is there in that I'm doing in my teaching, in my life, that's actually going to be permanent? A number of years ago, I was teaching at a seminary, and one of our founding professors had died the year before, about a year, a little more than a year before. And his family and the school together had commissioned a really wonderful life-size oil painting of him, sort of a head and shoulders shot of him in a position, that a pose that we often saw him in class. I'd had him as a professor, and then he was my colleague. And this painting hung in the main hallway of the seminary. And I was standing there one day just nearby, and these two students came along, and one of them said, "Who's that?" And the other one said, "I have no idea." And I thought, he's been dead for maybe 15 months at that point. And here we are saying, and he was, without him, this school wouldn't have been able to start. He's one of the founding members of your school that you're attending. No idea who he was. They never had him in class. And I say to my students, I tell my students that story, and I say, that's going to happen. And that's not something to really to mourn. It's something to say, to accept, and to say, this is the way the Lord has ordained our existence, our lives to be. They are temporary. They're fleeting. Well, he asks this question, is there any meaning in life? And then instead of answering it it would be nice if he'd just say yes or no. I mean, that would be really helpful. But he doesn't. He then writes a poem that goes from verse 4 really down through verse 10. And he says, look, let's think about the nature of existence. Let's think about life. Well, when it comes to human beings, this is the way it works. We have a church or an organization or a family, and there are some members who die, and there are new members who are born, who come in. And that's been going on. That's the way it's been. That's one of my arguments for if a church is at all able, one of my arguments for having the church in the middle of the cemetery is that the cemetery then becomes a reminder that every time we walk into the sanctuary, we're walking through a cloud of witnesses who have gone before us, without whom this church, that I take for granted, would not exist. And so when I come through, I think, yes, these are the generations that have come before me, that have gone back. My own church that I grew up in, a little tiny congregational church in East Woodstock, the cemetery, the graveyard went back into the early 1700s, and it was quite sobering to walk through. I mean, also occasion for Thanksgiving to walk through and look at those graves, from 300 years ago up to just a few years ago, and think of the people who have lived, and because they lived and because they were faithful, I have the opportunity to benefit. I can benefit from their faithfulness, but they're gone, and there's a new generation coming. I'm a grandfather. I'm actually a great grandfather a couple times, and I won't see those children grow up. I won't see them get married or see them have children and grandchildren, because time has gone by and this is the way life is. That doesn't make me particularly happy. I feel sad sometimes when I think about that, but then I remind myself, no, this was true. As Claudius says to Hamlet, although his motivation was somewhat different, yes, your father died and he had a father, and he died and he had a father, and it's just, well, that's the way things are. But that's what Kohelet says. This is the nature of human existence, and so we shouldn't be surprised that that's how it is. And then he turns to nature and he says, and look, it's the same thing. The sun comes up every morning, the wind blows this way and that way, and we don't know where it comes from exactly. I mean, we can tell what direction it comes from, but think of this: where does the wind start? And he said, well, it goes back apparently to get some more wind and keep blowing. Comes and goes, comes and goes. And water, he understood the hydrologic cycle, 1,000 years before Christ, 3,000 years ago. He says, look, the water comes down, it runs to the sea, and then it goes back to where it started from. It just keeps going around and around and around, just like the sun. And he sums it all up in the first line in verse 8. He says, everything's wearisome, tiring. Yeah, that's tough, isn't it? It's really tough, because it just seems to go on and on. But some of you I know read G.K. Chesterton, and in his essay, "The Ethics of Elfland," which is in his book chapters, I forget which chapter, 4 or 6 maybe, in his book Orthodoxy, he says maybe God doesn't get bored. Maybe God enjoys sunrise so much. Every morning he says to the sun, "Do it again," and to the moon, and every time it goes through its cycle, he says, "Do it again," because God doesn't get bored with repetition. He enjoys it. And as we know, there is no exact repetition of sunrises from one day to the next, or one year, or one season to the next. And so we look at these things and we think, oh yeah, it just keeps going around and around and around. When I was a boy, I was mowing the lawn one day, and I didn't like mowing the lawn because it was hot and noisy. We didn't have earplugs in those days, and I said, I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to have to do this again next week, and then I'm going to have to do it again the next week. Why am I doing this? What's the point? And then I thought, my dad goes to work every morning. He comes home, he eats dinner, and then he goes to bed, and then he gets up and goes to work, and then he comes. I said, what's the point? There's this cycle, right? We realize, and I know those thoughts are common to all kids have those thoughts at some point in their lives. Wasn't anything unique, but that's a reality, and this is the way it is. And Kohelet says, yeah, and it's tiring, isn't it, to think about that? And then he looks at the human ourselves and says, yeah, words are the same way. We just talk. We can't say enough we can't say anything new. And our eyes see all the time. Unless we're actually blind, our eyes see. They can't not see. So they're never satisfied. As long as if they're open, we're not blind, they're seeing something. And our ears are the same way. If we're not deaf and we're hearing things all the time, they're never satisfied. So he turns from this, okay, there are these cycles, and there's another cycle within us that says, I want to see more, I want to hear more, I want to say more, I want to do. And he says, and that never stops either. It just never stops. And so in verses 9 and 10, he says, so when we think about all these repetitions, there's nothing new. It's all been done before. Everything's been done. I remember when this will date me, of course. Well, you don't need me to date myself. Like, pretty obvious that I'm not young. But when the iPod came out, that was a thing where you could put lots of music. I think 5,000 songs on an iPod. Everybody said, wow, nothing like this has ever been done before. And I thought, well, sure it has. you had kings and emperors who would travel around and they would bring an entourage of musicians with them, and they just tell them, I want to hear Handel's water music, or I want to hear whatever it is, and the musicians would play it. That was their job. There's no difference. It's just that an iPod is a lot more convenient than a caravan of musicians with their instruments and tuning forks. So it's not really anything new. It's just a new way of doing something that's already been done before. Peter Kreeft wrote a book about Aristotle at Harvard, and in it he says Aristotle sees a car go by, an automobile go by, and he says, "Oh," he said, "I see. You have put the power of the horse inside the chariot." I thought, what? Well, of course, that's Peter Kreeft saying it, and he knows about the term horsepower, but still, that's a brilliant way of thinking that, yes, this is not, neither is this thing new that we think is so new. And then he ends with this, verse 11, which is the part that we really don't like. He says, "And we will all be forgotten. There's no remembrance of the first things, and also of the last things which are to come. There will be no remembrance of them among the things that come even later." And right away, my spirit at least rebels against that, and I think, no, I'll be remembered. But then I realize I won't be. I had students even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, that I thought, I will never forget this student. And now I can't even, if I met them on the street, I wouldn't recognize them. If I got a letter from them, I'd say, who is this? My wife and I got a letter from somebody a couple of years ago who said, "Oh, I want to thank you again for the Bible study that you led all those years when we lived in Center City, right down the street from 10th, which was our church, 10th Press. And we had a Bible study for, I guess, about 8 years in our apartment. And this guy wrote and said, that Bible study was so important to me. I want to thank you." And we had no idea. We couldn't remember his name. We had no idea who he might have been. And yet at the time, he was one of our faithful members who was there every week, and the kind of person about whom we'd say, yeah, we'll never forget him. But it happens. And Kohelet says, look, guys, this is the way life is. And it's easy to read this and think, oh, this is a philosophy of despair. But that's not what he's doing. This is not despair. He is being realistic, and he's saying to us, so your goal in life should not be to be remembered. Remember what Absalom did. Long before he died, before he rebelled against his father, he set up a pillar in his own name so that his name wouldn't die out, so people would remember him. He put up his own monument. I mean, that's a little chutzpah, don't you think? Well, we have what Kohelet says is, that's not the gold ring, guys. Don't grab for that. And he's going to go on to say, what is the gold ring? Well, the gold ring is to do what's right, to love God, enjoy your wife all the days of your youth, he says, toward the end of the book. And to recognize you're not in control, you're going to die, you'll be forgotten. And that's okay. That's okay. Because we know from the New Testament, things probably that he didn't know or couldn't have known, that we're never forgotten, that in the mind of God, not one hair falls from our heads or one sparrow drops from the sky, that we live forever. And so not only are we not forgotten, we're given a new name, a new identity, a new relationship, a new life. And that goes on forever. So, any thoughts, guys?
Well, I just want you to know that in Genesis, Rebecca, I'm talking to you, Isaac's wife. You're the mother, as it says in one of the verses, you are the mother of the people, and I get it. Sarah, I love you dearly. I love you, Sarah, but I really love Rebecca. What that lady went through is amazing. She is my mother. So you think I'm forgetting Rebecca? No way. Am I forgetting you, babe? I'm going to see you. So Sandy's going to see Rebecca and Isaac. I'm going to see them physically, face to face, just like my Redeemer, Job. just like you're going to see the Redeemer, and I'm going to see the Redeemer too. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. But I'm also going to see you, Rebecca, and you are my mom. So you don't think I take my mom seriously?
Sure.
Babe, you are my mother, and I am not forgetting you.
Yep.
What do you think of that, Lee Vogel? What do you think of that? What do you think of me, remembering these people? Are you going to see these people up there too, Lee? Are you going to see them?
I'm surrounded by graphs out here in Lancaster County, so I'm daily with you.
Thank you.
I was going to say is when I walk our dog, I walk through a cemetery every day. I look at all the headstones, and you look, who were these people? What did they do? On some of the headstones, sometimes there's a little bit of information as to who they were. You always know when they were born and when they died. But I had an organic chemistry professor, and what you were saying about when you walk through a cemetery, you think who these people were, that they came before you, they built this church. And he always said, we have to struggle to possess that, what we inherit from our grandfathers. I think that's part of what you were saying, that when you go to your church, you think there were people who came here to put the first stone down on the foundation, beneficiary of that. And that kind of gives you a sense of purpose. Remember them, but they kind of move forward to maybe put the second brick down.
Well, it certainly should increase your sense of responsibility and stewardship to carry on. I don't know. When you were talking about breath, we're studying Genesis with Joe Modica for his fall semester at the Wayne Pres on Sunday mornings. And we just got through the two creation stories. And there's a lot of talk about breath in there. There's a lot of talk about from dust to dust. I'm wondering whether you would lead us to think that there are echoes in Ecclesiastes that go back to Genesis 1 and 2.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's a different word for breath. It's not the same word. That's nishmat. This is hevel, but it's yeah, certainly he's thinking that way, especially because he uses the word Adam a fair amount. He doesn't always use the word ish, so he's using Adam, Adam, which is also variously translated mankind, humankind, humanity, that sort of thing. So I think yeah, definitely he has those stories in his mind.
I mean, after the fall, Adam has to toil the fields, right? I mean,
yeah, there's an interesting little book by Francis Schaeffer done back in the 70s, as most of his books were, but called Genesis in Space and Time. And one of the things that he points out is that the genealogies are yes, they're a record of birth, but he said they're also a record of death, right? That it doesn't matter if you're Methuselah, you live 969 years, you still die. I've challenged my students sometimes because they say, "Oh no, we remember people from the past," and they'll name some people, William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, and whoever else. And I think, okay, so let's see. Come on, we're going to do it right now on the board. We're going to write all the names we can think of before Christ, and you can't use any biblical characters because that's kind of cheating, But all the names you can think of. We never come close to filling the board. Never. Somebody says Shupil Yuma. Okay, well, who was he? Well, I don't know, but I just heard that name sometimes, so I'm pretty sure he was somebody. So we think, on the one hand, that we remember, but in fact, we just don't know most people who have lived and died. Just like most people won't know us. I was a gopher for C. Everett Koop. Let me show you. This was one of his fountain pens. When I was his gopher at Children's Hospital, one day I came in and his secretary said, Betty Smith said, Fred, could you empty Dr. Koop's trash can because he cleaned out his desk? And so of course, that was my job to do whatever I was asked. So I was in college, so I picked up the trash can to carry it, and I looked down, and there were several bottles of fountain pen ink. There was this fountain pen. There were 3 fountain pens and 2 fountain pen stands. I have another one another one right here, this crystal or glass, not crystal, but this one, and I said, I'm not throwing those out. I didn't say that to her. I just very quietly put them all in my pocket and walked around with bulging pockets for the rest of the day. But you know, I tell that, and my students have no idea who C. Everett Koop was.
Oh,
I preached at 10th Press 11 years after Jim Boyce died, and I happened to mention him in one of my sermons. And one of the associate pastors said to me afterward, they said, maybe 30% of the people in this congregation even know who Jim Boyce was.
mm.
And you think, yeah, it just passes so quickly. And so to try to do something for the sake of fame, for permanence. You know, in my field in academics, one of the greatest ambitions is to write the book that will still be used in 3 generations. If you can do that, boy, you've really made it. And I think, yeah, 3 generations, what does that count for in the scheme of existence?
Yeah.
So-
Well, it is 8 o'clock, Fred, and we want to honor your need to get to class. So at this point, would you at least pray us out? And
Sure.
we can
Yeah.
stay, the rest of us can stay on a little bit more if we want to chat.
I'm honored. Yeah, I'm honored. Let's pray together. Our great God and Heavenly Father, you in whom we live and move and have our being, we thank you for your preservation of us from the beginning of our lives to this day, for having brought us safely through the night, for giving us this day of our lives. And so we offer you our bodies and our souls for your service, for the good of those around us, for the sake of Jesus Christ, in whose love and in whose fellowship we live. Amen.
Amen.
Lord, hear our-
Amen. Amen. Thank you,
Thanks so
Fred.
much, guys.
Thanks, Fred.
See you
All
next
right,
week.
keep enjoying
We look-
your field of expertise. It's